It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first of this term's 2 Brendan Gill lectures. The reason there are 2 Gill lectures this semester can be attributed to last January's weather, when this evening's speaker, Joel Kotkin, was unable to successfully make his way to New England from California. I don't know how hard he really tried when he read those weather reports. Later this term, Kenneth Frampton will deliver a second Gill lecture. The Gill Lecture Series has a distinguished history, bringing important critics and historians to our school. The roster of previous Gill lecturers includes Wendy Steiner, Esther DeCosta Meyer, David Hickey, Kenneth Frampton, Charles Jenks, Roger Khanna, Hal Foster, and Nasser Rabat. The diversity of this roster of speakers is as it should be, given that Brendan Gill, Yale College class of 1936, was for most of his long career a writer with wide-ranging interests. For 50 years, Gill was associated with the New Yorker magazine, contributing drama criticism and architecture criticism, among other forms. As an architecture critic, he took over the Skyline column that had previously been Louis Mumford's. Mr. Kotkin is the 30th lecturer in the Gill series. Joel Kotkin is an internationally recognized authority on economic, political, and social trends. A native New Yorker, he attended the University of California at Berkeley before establishing residence in Los Angeles. Mr. Kotkin's first book, published in 1982, California Inc., California Incorporated, dealt with the Golden State's links to the emerging powers of the Pacific Rim. In 1988, he co-authored The Third Century, America's Resurgence in the Asian Era, which has been translated into Japanese and Chinese, and has also a special English edition published in the Pacific Rim. Mr. Kotkin is also the author of Tribes, How Race, Religion, and Identity Determine Success in the New Global Economy. Tracing the connection between ethnicity and business success, Tribes has been published in Chinese, Japanese, Arabic, and German. In 2000, he published The New Geography, How the Digital Revolution is Reshaping the American Landscape. His 2006 book, The City, A Global History, has had wide readership with numerous international editions. Mr. Kotkin's most recent book, The Next 100 Million, America in 2050, was published in 2010. In each of these books and his very many other publications, Joel Kotkin has documented and interpreted, and in many ways successfully predicted, some of the most important events of our time. Please join me in welcoming Joel Kotkin, 30th Brendan Gill Lecturer, as he delivers the talk, The American Landscape in 2050. Joel.
I'm going to start off with, first of all, I'm thrilled to be here. I guess I didn't know that they let Berkeley guys speak at Yale, so I'm rarely, but we'll make this exception. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a lot of material. I changed a lot of things because we now have the 2010 census, so I thought it would be fun to sort of say, what did the census tell us? A lot of the things I'm going to talk about are probably things you don't want to hear. Certainly maybe some of your professors don't want to hear, some of your future employers probably don't want to hear, but you're going to hear them anyway. So let me start off by talking a little bit about sort of the big picture. This Amsterdam, which 18th century Amsterdam is 17th century Amsterdam, is kind of one of my great ideals in the book, The City. And of course, this wonderful quote from Descartes, an inventory of the possible. Otherwise, I think cities should be about places that are transformational for the people who go there. And one of the things that worries me about cities today, and I've been very involved in writing about the issue of class, and I'll bring that up several times tonight, is that cities are now increasingly becoming, the more elite cities are becoming places that really are not very good at bringing in and transforming people the way my grandparents and my parents were transformed coming from the shtetl in Russia to New York City. Those kinds of opportunities are rarer and rarer in our great cities, and they're becoming more and more what you might call boutique cities. So we'll get into a little bit of that. Whereas, let's say, Amsterdam was a place that brought people from the German countryside, the Dutch countryside, people coming from Spain, people coming from Portugal, and recreating themselves. And that's really what I think the magic of a great city is all about. So I want to talk about a few things. One is population dynamics. I'm going to, or I've just started a project on the whole question of childlessness in the 21st century on a global level. So I've been very involved and concerned with the issue of population dynamics and how are we designing cities and places so people can have children, because we've been sort of schooled, particularly those of us who are boomers, in the fact that we had too many people. But in many parts of the world, the biggest problem is really going to be aging and eventually population implosion, which I think is beginning to take place. And this is a big issue, particularly I teach in Singapore, and it's a very big issue there. I want to talk about something that architects sometimes ignore. What is it that people want? I mean, in other words, not what the architectural critics want, but what people want, what works for people. One of the great things one of the great things about a New England town or Amsterdam, 17th century Amsterdam, is that they really did seem to be something that was accommodating to basic human needs. We'll talk a little bit about the future of the middle class, which is obviously a big topic today. And then I'm going to throw out some stuff on sustainability, which is a word that every time I hear it, I want to rush to the bathroom, but because it is one of the most overused and most exploited terms, often exploited by people who have no business talking about it at all. Okay. Here's our, as of now, we would expect that by 2050, the United States would have about 100 million more people. The United States has is really a distinction as being the only advanced industrial country with a rapidly growing population of any size. Australia, to some extent, has this. Canada has it mostly from immigration. But the other reasons is religiosity, which I know is a dirty word in most universities, but religious people have kids, and secular people, generally speaking, are less likely to have kids, and then the question of the numbers of kids. And the fact that we have land and we have single-family homes. Because one thing is absolutely true, is in the modern context, density drops family formation and drops the number of children people have. It's just, it's pretty clear. And this is, by the way, one of the great challenges that we have in Singapore now is, obviously Singapore has to be dense. How do we build dense places where people would have children? Because their fertility rate is about half that of the United States. Will the United States hit 400 million? There's been some people say 500 million, some say 450. Now, there is a scenario which could have us down about 370, and that it would be a cutback in immigration. Some of it by policy, some of it by the fact that the birth rates in many of our major sending countries have dropped dramatically. It's interesting, Brazil and Iran, two countries, actually have lower fertility rates than the United States now. I've just finished a big project on this, and many of our sending countries, of course, most of East Asia has very, very low birth rates. And so it's conceived, and even Mexico has actually dropped it down to around 2. So that may have an effect. And then if we had a planning regime, which many architects would like, in which we only had high density housing near bus stops, that would probably depress your housing as well, your population as well. Some people think that'd be good. Some people think the less humans, the better, as long as we don't eliminate them. This puts us in a very unique and both advantageous and also challenging situation. The workforce in the United States between 2000 and 2050 is supposed to go up about 40%. You guys are basically in the very dangerous situation, as we boomers were in the 70s. Big increase in the labor force during an extraordinarily weak economy. I think there was a very clever remark about the the best solution was to marry rich, marry young. I think was that your advice? Okay, yeah, okay. I guess I married old and didn't marry a rich person, so I'm obviously quite stupid. China is a very interesting case. Started going to China 30 years ago. They are facing, particularly in their urban areas, a real population implosion. They will probably see their workforce begin to decline about 2030, 2040. I think it may happen faster because of the fact that so many Chinese are not having kids. And then they have this inconvenient thing about 35 million more marriage or age boys than girls. Now, I live in the San Fernando Valley, which is the porn capital of the world, so we see this as a great opportunity for us. Nevertheless, that would be a problem. But also, what's really interesting is the tremendous slowdown in Europe, in Korea, and in Japan, where you're going to see major reductions in the workforce. So we have this weird situation where we're seeing certain parts of the world really getting into a situation which will not be tenable fiscally. The United States might get through it if we take this increase in the labor force and we actually employ them, which is a question. United States, a friend of mine from Nebraska, always hates it when the Northeasterners or Californians say, "Oh, the country's too crowded, there's no land left." And he always says, well, you know what, next time they fly across the country, push them out of the plane in Nebraska. This is a very big country. And what's interesting is in terms of our land use, the urban part of our land use is actually has not really grown very much. And what's really interesting is our open space has increased, our forest land has increased over the last 20 or 30 years. One of the things that's happened, for instance, particularly here in New England, but also in other parts of the country, marginal farmland has been abandoned and turned back to forest. And that's probably a very good thing. But anyway, we have lots of land, and even though agriculture takes less space, we actually produce much more food. So that's some reasonably good news. So where are we headed in the United States? I think, where are people going? I don't know if any of you are basketball fans. I mean, this may be soon to be extinct sport, but those of us who grew up in New York are quite aware of it. Where are people going? I like to look where you have to watch people's feet. Where are they going? Not what they may tell you if you ask them certain questions in a certain way. You can sort of distort any answer. I like to know, okay, what did they decide? What did they buy? And I think where they're going increasingly is places where there's going to be jobs and opportunities. Many of you, I'm sure, would love to go to New York. You'd love to go to Boston. You'd love to go maybe to San Francisco. Good luck finding a job. And I think that what you're going to find is that there are limited opportunities in these places. And if you look at where people are moving, they are moving to places where there are jobs. So there's this theory that jobs will go to where certain people migrate. But actually, I think increasingly people will migrate to where there are jobs and also where they can afford to live. And that's also a very big thing. I think we will continue to see some recovery of certain urban environments, but suburbia can only be legislated out of existence. That's the only way you can stop people from wanting to have a single family house. I'm going to talk about some of the interesting groups I think are going to shape America in the next 30 or 40 years. The aging boomers, the millennials, who are you, and the immigrants. Those are the three groups that are growing. And so sort of trying to understand where these people are going. And then I'm going to talk about where I think the built environment of the future will be. The biggest fact of our times is job shortage. And this is one of the hardest things for us to get around. Is about 20 million, we're about 20 million jobs short this decade. Even when we get a little bump up in our employment, let's say of 50 or 100, 150,000 a month, we need about 250,000 a month just to keep up with the increase in the labor force. So this is going to become more and more important as time goes on. And as you can see, what we're experiencing is not the official unemployment rate is kind of irrelevant. The really important rate is what we call the U6, which is the people who are underemployed, have dropped out of the workforce. And nationwide, it's somewhere around 18%. Some people think it's 20. In the state of California, it's well over 20. So you're talking about a huge part of the population that really isn't engaged in the workforce. And they're going to move, I think, to where they can find work over time. Now, where did jobs increase in the last decade? Now, it's very mixed bag. Riverside and Phoenix, and even though they've lost jobs, are way ahead of where they were in 2000. They just have more people than they have jobs. Houston did pretty well. Washington, D.C., your tax dollars at work. I mean, Washington, D.C. is sort of just this gigantic parasite that is just sucking the life out of everybody. I mean, I agree that you should occupy Wall Street, but I think you should occupy Washington too. Miami has had considerable growth. Seattle, of the what you might call the more preferred urbanist locales, has actually done relatively well. But of course, most of that growth is in the suburbs, as we'll see. San Diego, Dallas, Atlanta, and you'll see where this comes from soon. Now, the reason I use this is where our STEM is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics related jobs. And as you can see, the growth, again, now obviously North Dakota, Wyoming, Nevada, small base, but Texas, Virginia, and where the STEM jobs have been declining include places like California. Last year, one measurement came out, California lost about 18,000 high-tech jobs last year. So despite Facebook and all that hysteria, is still losing jobs. Interestingly enough, the one place that really had strong STEM job growth was the state of Michigan, because a lot of technology people actually end up working when the auto industry started to recover to some extent. Most of the states on the coast had very paltry growth. So when people say to you, well, yeah, there's been job growth in XYZ and Houston and they're all crummy jobs, that's just not the case. There are a lot of crummy jobs all over the country. And by the way, does anyone know what the largest employment category in the private sector in New York is? Waiters. Waiters and waitresses. That's your biggest employment segment. So as somebody said, New York is the place to be if you want to be a waiter. So what is this new demography that we're seeing emerge? One, people are moving to smaller towns and cities. For most of the 20th century, the movement was to bigger and bigger and bigger cities, more megapolitan. The more recent trends are actually quite different. People are moving to smaller scale cities, and many of these cities are actually much more interesting than they were a long time ago. One thing is you have the internet, so if you're living in Nashville, or you're living in Huntsville, or you're living in a whole series of smaller cities, you are plugged in a way that you weren't. You know, Marx talked about the idiocy of rural life. Well, I can tell you there's some pretty smart farmers living in the middle of North Dakota, and they know as much about the commodity markets as anybody trading in Chicago. So I think there's a big trend. And about the fact that decentralization, not centralization, is the natural trend. The question is, will we arrest it by policy? And I think up until between 2008 and 2010, I think it is possible that the federal government would have tried to do it. I think the political reality is that there aren't enough votes in the dense urban areas to command anything close to a political majority in terms of the Congress. If we take a look at domestic migration, now domestic migration is different from immigration. It's people who are already here moving to another place, people voting with their feet, Phoenix, Riverside, Atlanta, Dallas, Houston. Seattle is unusual in the sense that it is a relatively expensive area that gets people. Now, one of the things about Seattle is they have something called an economy. And they have companies like Microsoft and Costco and Starbucks that are growing, Amazon, that are growing concerns that employ lots of people. They're very unusual in that way. People have been leaving Los Angeles, New York. One of the interesting things about LA, which is my adopted hometown, our population growth between 2000 and 2010 was the least we've had since the turn of the century. So, our brilliant, in quotes, mayor, Villaraigosa, said, well, we're going to have to accommodate people, we're going to have to densify everything. I said, Antonio, where are the people? You have to have people coming in, plus a lot of this density was very expensive. So what you have is luxury condos now inhabited by USC students, and after a generation of USC students, they won't be very luxurious. What areas are growing overall in population? Again, Las Vegas. A lot of the problems that some of these areas have is they grew very fast, and then the economy cratered, and so they have lots of problems. But Raleigh, Austin are certainly in much better shape. Charlotte is in between. But basically, the population growth continues to go to these cities. So, since you're architects, you're supposed to be building something for people who actually need it. And this is probably where you're going to see the growth. Some places like Nashville, Denver, so they're not, you don't have to move to Houston. I happen to like Houston, but after all, I also like Los Angeles. But I think that there are many cities, smaller cities, that are going to be pretty attractive to people. Again, I would look at Nashville, Raleigh as ones that might be attractive to some of you. The slowest growth, again, you can see where the slowest growth is. One of the great things that's happened has been this very, very slow growth. Now, New Orleans, by the way, is really an interesting case. I'm working on a project in New Orleans right now, and it is beginning to turn around very quickly. And if I was an architect, which I'm not, I would really think about New Orleans, because they're building, they're rebuilding, and the city is now attracting lots of people from both coasts who want to be in a place with great music, great architecture, the best food in the country, and is still cheap. So when I go to New Orleans, I'm very struck by the number of really bright young people who go there. There's a growing film industry there, growing video industry there. It's one of the places where a lot of the game companies are looking at. Very interesting place to look at in the future, the next 10 years, is New Orleans. But then you have your usual Rust Belt cities that have done very poorly. But it's very interesting that places like LA and San Francisco have also grown very slowly. These are the metro areas. In some cases, the cities have either had no population growth or lost population. One of the big things that's driving a lot of these demographics are the price of housing. The median multiple is a ratio we use of how many years of income would it take, median income, to buy a median price house. This is stuff that I know architects don't want to talk about, but I'll talk about it. So what happens is you begin to get, if you get certain places that become very unaffordable, and so people either leave there, or, as I just came back from Australia, where they have incredibly draconian legislation for a place that's got 0.3% of its land urbanized, that they now have, like, for instance, Adelaide is more expensive than Seattle. Makes no sense at all. And it's beginning to affect their economy in that people's mortgage payments are such a huge percentage of their income, even though their economy has done okay. In the US, there are some fairly reasonably priced places, but generally speaking, historically, it was 3 years income, median income for a house, for a median price house. And in many parts of the US and the UK and Australia, it can be about 6, 7, in some places 8. We are starting to work in Singapore. We may think it may now be 20 in Singapore and 11, 12 in Hong Kong. So that means that the possibility, see, what's interesting is you got to think of it from the point of view of the next generation of buyers. So very often boomers, being arrogant and self-centered, look at the world and they say, well, I bought my house in San Francisco in 1980 and I did okay. Yeah, you did really well. But how about the kid who came in and may want to live in San Francisco, has no hope of ever buying a house? I had one of those road to Damascus moments when I was working on a project in St. Louis at Washington University, postdocs, the brightest of the bright. Every city would like to have these people. And I was sort of doing my usual questioning, and I said, what are you doing in St. Louis? Why would you be in St. Louis? And what they said to me is, I would like to live in Boston. I'd like to live in San Diego. I'd like to live in New York, but I would never be able to buy a house. Because for your generation, the choices may be more limited than they were for my generation. Frankly, I couldn't afford the house I live in right now if I had to buy it now. And so what you're seeing is a pushing out effect in which many younger people are, and as you'll see later, immigrants are beginning to move to more affordable places. The word affordability and architecture probably don't match very well, but nevertheless, it is a reality of most people's lives. So then we started to look at where people are moving, what size of city are they moving to? And basically, the sweet spot seems to be somewhere between, well, maybe 2.5 million and 300,000. You know, when I was in Nashville recently, what was really interesting is I just asked, you know, how much was a house and where could you go? You could live 30 minutes from downtown Nashville and live in the countryside. You could also buy an apartment in the middle of the city for $250,000, $300,000 in a really nice neighborhood. So this is something that we're beginning to see where we start studying where are people moving to, and we find affordability is important. But look, Youngstown is affordable too. So it's got to be affordable, it's got to have jobs, and then you basically start to figure out what your relative quality of life is. So I always like the term affordable quality of life. You know, people say to me, well, wouldn't you want to live in New York? I said, well, you know, if Mike Bloomberg gives me his place, I'll move to New York. But the fact of the matter is I've got 2 kids and a dog and a wife, and there's no way I could possibly afford to live in New York City. None, zero. I mean, it would wipe out everything I've earned in my life to live in New York City. So I'm not going. And as you can see, the big metros have generally lost in domestic migration. So I thought you'd get a kick out of this one. We have a technology now that we use where we want to find out where are people going from one place to another. So we wanted to find out, because I was speaking in Raleigh, where are people moving to Raleigh from? And of course, you can see by far the biggest source is the New York metropolitan area, northern New Jersey. The Boston area is pretty good sender. And then somewhat in California. If you go to Denver or Seattle, you'll see the movement is much more from the West Coast. The idea to me, as a quite nationalistic Californian by nature, that people are leaving California because they really either can't find a job, can't buy a house, can't live where they would want to live, is actually quite shocking. And if you look at the migration patterns, they're very interesting. Los Angeles County was the only major county in the United States that has less Hispanic children now than it had a decade ago. So what we're pretty sure is Hispanic families are leaving LA. But this is sort of the new pattern. So if you look at, I could show you Raleigh, I could show you Nashville. I could show you Denver to some extent. Denver is not quite as spectacular, neither is Seattle, but they both have the same pattern of the big coastal regions losing population. People deciding that, you know what, I really can't afford San Francisco, but Seattle's not bad. And so you see a lot of that kind of movement. Okay, here's the question. Where would you choose to live? Now this is the National Association of Realtors, but Smart Growth America. And what we find is that, and what's really interesting historically, the number of people who want to live dense urban has been between 10 and 20% for about 40 years. It's, when you ask, do you want to live in a dense urban environment, that's about what you get, 10 to 20%. Now look, I'm not necessarily against it. I live in the city of Los Angeles, lived in the city of Los Angeles since 1975. Now, some people don't consider it a city, but I do. Most people want to live in a suburb close to the city. They don't really want to live that far out. There's about 18% who will go for the exurb. And a lot of them say they want to live rural communities. That, by the way, is stronger with older people than younger people. And I think part of it is older people, a lot of them were brought up in rural areas and have a sort of nostalgia for moving back to the countryside. Very interesting, but I'll show you on millennial attitudes, much weaker interest in the countryside. Now, when they grow up, we'll see, they may be different, but that's what we know for now. So, of course, we have the brilliant conventional wisdom, which I'm sure you've been taught. And this is our brilliant HUD secretary. We've reached the limits of suburban development. People are beginning to vote with their feet and come back to the central cities. Well, I would say, Secretary Donovan, You ever look at the numbers? Do you have any justification, or are you just reading the New York Times? And I was a columnist in the New York Times, so I mean, I have friends there, and I think they do some great stuff. But part of the mission of the New York Times is to sell a New York and dense urbanism, because in my opinion, if you're going to live a dense urban life, there's really only one really great city to live in the United States, and that's New York. As you can tell from my accent, that's my hometown. Now, so I said, and this is the census data. 15% of the metropolitan growth was in the core cities. Let's say the 5 boroughs of New York, Cook County. So it's actually even larger than the core itself. We usually use a county. In the decade of the 2000s, to our surprise, did not expect this, actually suburban share grew. Now, Sean Donovan never looked at these numbers, but these are the numbers that we have from the last census. Then we said, well, I thought you'd be interested in taking a look at New York, since you're sort of on the extreme outskirts of New York. And this is sort of part of the general story. And again, I believe New York City is the most attractive place to live a dense urban lifestyle in the United States. Actually, I think it's the only other city that competes with it globally, in my mind, is London. But if you take a look, New York is a very typical trajectory. The suburbs in the 50s, complete domination, city lost population, terrible decade of the 70s. And by the way, if you're a peak oil theorist, I don't know how people still believe in that, but anyway, if they do, that was a period of high oil prices. You can see what happened. There was actually a huge exodus from the cities. That was probably the nadir of urbanism, was in the 1970s. I remember going to the city, and you were constantly looking behind whether somebody was catching up on you, because they weren't going to do very nice things to you. Then the 80s, there was kind of a beginning of a resurgence. Really starts under Mayor Koch. What's really interesting is that the Reagan boom was very good for New York City because of the growth of the financial service industry. Then in the 90s, it was very interesting. The New York urban core grew almost as much as the suburban areas. That was we hadn't seen that in a very long time. And then we can see in 2000, 2010, it reversed back. And so, see, part of the problem is that academics and media people live in a universe, and that universe is made up of people like them. And so people in New York always know people who moved to New York, but they don't tend to know the people who left. Plus, a lot of the people who left are like my family. They're from unfashionable parts of Brooklyn, and those people leave, and you wouldn't have noticed them anyway. The Trustafarian living in Williamsburg, I mean, and in some cases, if you knew some of my family, you'd be happy that they left too. So what is really happening over time is cities are becoming less dense, in that their urban cores have less people. Now, Manhattan has had some population growth, not huge, but some. But if you go to, let's say, Paris, the population, and I can get you these numbers if you're interested, the population of the historic Paris is actually dropped from its highs. Same thing with London. Most of these cities had much denser populations, and of course, the Lower East Side at one time was the densest place in the world. I remember taking my now 16-year-old daughter to the Tenement Museum in New York City, which is, if you're ever there, it's worth seeing, to understand how people lived and how incredibly dense and how incredibly crowded that was. So what has happened is, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, is that the urban area, the nicer urban areas, I'm not necessarily saying New Haven, the nicer urban areas, well, I got to get you upset somehow. The nicer urban areas have become what I would call boutique cities. And so what you have is, instead of a family of 4 living in a flat, you have 2 people living in a flat, or 1 person living in a flat. So this drives down your population numbers, because the areas are nicer, they're more affluent, but they have fewer families, and they're much less dense. And as you can see, the one place that's become denser is Los Angeles. And I predict Houston will become denser over time, but starting from a much lower base. So anyway, I thought that would be kind of interesting. Then I thought, because of, I know some of you might be interested in the global perspective, Mexico City, most of the growth is on the outskirts. Actually, I remember going down to near the edges, and there's quite a few people living there, and there's just these gigantic malls, and you see this all over the developing world. These gigantic malls on the outskirts of the cities. And as you can see, the actual historic core of Mexico City is actually lost population. Beijing, of course, big increase in the population of the region, but most of that growth has been in the outer rings, the actual inner city of Beijing, the inner part, the first ring, that's actually had about stagnant population. And I could just see down the road, maybe as China becomes more wealthier, if it doesn't completely fall apart, there'll probably be a really heavy-duty, kind of yuppie kind of existence in the inner rings of Beijing. But the growth keeps going further and further out. When I first came to Beijing in 1982, there was a second ring, a little bit of a third ring, and now they're talking about a fifth and sixth ring. And what's very interesting is a lot of the tech business, as is true almost everywhere in the world, is in the outer rings of the city. And beyond the outer rings, I have photographs on this that I've actually published in Forbes. There are now large, essentially, slums of migrant workers, which the Chinese government is probably not happy that I took pictures of. So what is the future of metropolitan space? I'm not negative at all about where the metropolitan space, but understand what it was. And H.G. Wells, who was probably the most prescient of all futurists, made the point. He said, it will be a bazaar, a great gallery of shops, places of concourse and rendezvous. What you see is not new office buildings, in very few new office buildings, but high-end residents, high-end art galleries, that kind of lifestyle. And of course, what we're seeing increasingly in great cities like New York and Paris and London is the large percentage of the purchasers are foreigners and people with second and third residences. I think in New York it was 1 in 10 at one point. And now, of course, Schumer's in the desperate need to save the New York real estate market from some possible problems on Wall Street. He's now talking about giving people residence visas if they'll buy property. I mean, I know exactly whose interest he's working in, as he always is. So basically, I mean, it's a different role. It's not that the city is going to die. It's just the city plays a different role. It plays a demographic role, young people. It plays a different role with very wealthy people, and then their servant classes, i.e. the waiters. Now, what about the population groups? So we start drilling into the population groups that are coming up. The millennials, your generation, is the largest generation in American history, although as a percentage of the population, you're much smaller than the boomers were at that time. In other words, the boomers had children, but they didn't have as many children as their parents had, and but generally you would talk about 80 million. Basically, we're talking about a group born after 1982 or 1983. You can call them millennials, or you can call them echo boomers, or you can call Generation Y, but that's you. This is research done by Magadan Associates, a big survey research company. They asked millennials, what is your ideal place to live? Now, it is very interesting that they are much more than previous generations. A big city is about 17%. Now, whether that changes over time, it would certainly change probably for the smaller percentage, but that's a significant change. We were shocked to see suburbs were so big. And the theory that we have, and I can't prove it, but I think is young people grew up in suburbs, and they may want to live in an urban environment for a while, but when they get older, they still think of themselves with a backyard and some sort of suburban environment. And I can show you, I can sort of prove that to you. Interesting thing with the countryside, older people, much more attracted to moving out of the metropolitan areas than younger people. Obviously, there's jobs. are certainly a factor there. But it's interesting that we were very shocked because you can see among the older generation, suburbs only did about a third, and they got about 43% among the millennials. Then, but again, thinking about basketball and watching feet, we did a really interesting exercise. We took the generation that was 25 to 34 in 2000 and said, where were they in 2010? This is the wonderful thing about the census. It really is, you know, even if Sean Donovan doesn't pay attention to it. What we found is that the population, as people began to go into their mid-30s, early 40s, shifted dramatically away from the urban core to suburban locations by a pretty huge margin. And I think that has to do with a lot of things. Now, can cities attract more of these people? Yeah, if they fix the schools, if they keep the great neighborhoods that are, I would say, moderate to low density, they could conceivably capture a lot of that a lot more of that population. But under current circumstances, that's not happening. And so what we generally see is as people get older, as they get serious about their careers, as they start businesses, as they start to get married and have kids, they begin to move to suburban areas. Now, your generation is a very odd one because you have no place to go, because when you get out of here, you have a hard time getting a job unless you marry, you know, because you couldn't always marry a rich person.
Go to Yale, you're going to have a hard time getting a job.
Well, maybe not getting the job that you wanted to get in the place you wanted to get it.
We'll discuss that.
Okay. Well, since I don't have any financial stake in the university, I just say, generally speaking, this is the case. So of your generation, or the people that you're going to serve, they're going to have a hard time getting a job. I mean, one of the things we know for a fact is a very large number of people in their 20s are moving back with their parents. And that, I don't know where that goes long term. So then we started to say, okay, where are college graduates going? So we said, where is the biggest increase in college graduates? Now, New Orleans, as I was saying earlier, is a really interesting case study. Because I do think that people do like, a lot of people like the historic character of New Orleans, and again, affordability. But then you're really talking about Raleigh, Austin, Nashville, Kansas City, Birmingham. San Diego is the only one that you would think naturally, Denver to some extent, Columbus, Seattle, Portland. You can see, you know, it's a mixed bag, but surprising number of the college educated are moving to places that you wouldn't necessarily think have big college educated populations. Then we sort of asked, okay, college graduates, where are they moving? And from the same data, we saw that generally speaking, they went to lower density than higher density as a group. Again, if you're an editor at the New York Times, you think everybody lives in New York because everybody you know lives in New York. It's like the old Pauline Kael thing. She can't believe that Nixon was reelected because she didn't know anyone who voted for Nixon. Anyone who's worked in New York publishing as long as I have knows how amazingly out of touch New York publishers are. I've had one, I remember one of my, when I had a change in editors at the Times, and they said, the new editor said, oh, you're not going to like her. And I said, why? He said, well, the only part of the world that this woman sees, part of New York that this woman sees is Manhattan, and the only time she ever sees anything else is when she takes the cab to the airport to go for a summer vacation in France. That's about the only time. So she got to see, you know, I guess part of the Van Wyck Expressway or something. Now, the other big group is immigrants. Now, what's really interesting is whereas the nativists are all worried about too many immigrants, I think longer term we're going to have a shortage of immigrants. Because again, the sending countries are losing population, and as our economy continues to fumble, less reason to come here. But immigration has been the thing that's really driven the demographic dynamism, and I would argue the entrepreneurial dynamism of the United States for a long time. So where do immigrants live? Well, in 1980, they were about 40, pretty even between cities and suburbs. Now it's predominantly suburbs. And now many immigrants move immediately to suburbs. That's particularly true in some of these Sunbelt cities, which never had big immigrant communities. So there was no reason to go into, there wasn't some historic ethnic neighborhood to go to. So like if you look at, let's say, for instance, Asian and Hispanic populations, particularly Asian populations in southern cities, they're very suburbanized. Because there's no reason for them to be, there's no historic Asian community for them to be in. In many cases, they're building historic Asian communities. So some of the most interesting places in the retail world are actually being built for immigrants in the outer rings of cities. Now, the immigration is still strongest in Miami and LA, the traditional ones, but I take a look at Dallas and Houston. Dallas and Houston now get a higher rate of immigration than Chicago and Philadelphia. So something is happening, and I think part of it is that there's job opportunities, and I always look at immigrants as canaries in the coal mine. They're going to go to where there's opportunity. They have less prejudices about where they're going to go. Then we looked at the fastest growing foreign populations. I mean, I was in, when I was driving around, Nashville to Little Kurdistan in Nashville. I mean, that was pretty interesting. And there was a little, Somalia, and I mean, lots of these places like Nashville and Charlotte, and I think that's going to accelerate as the immigrant network of information begins to say, you can get a job in Houston, you can get a job in Nashville, you can buy a house. Whereas if you come to Los Angeles or New York, you're going to be living in a very crowded place with much less ability to ever buy a house. And so I think this has really been an interesting shift. And this is going to be a big driver of where there's going to be retail. Immigrants tend to have more children. They are generally more upwardly mobile, and their purchasing power is growing tremendously. My class at Chapman on Monday, we're going to the Diamond Center on Jamboree Road in Irvine, California. It, in the middle of the recession, opened totally leased from the beginning. Never empty. Dr. Althea Shrew, who is the president of the company, she said they actually were able to have all the leases signed before they finished building. And if you go there, it's just an amazing place. It's sort of this Pan-Asian kind of setting. But then a friend of mine in Houston, I gave him the idea of which it's too bad I never had any money, of taking old malls that were dying and Hispanicizing them. And he did something called La Grande Plaza in outside of Fort Worth, Texas, and it is minted money from day one. I mean, it is just, and it is packed. And if you see what's going on in these places where the immigrants are sort of reinventing even the mall, it's pretty interesting. And this is my friend Tim Cisneros. I always, he's related to Henry Cisneros. I always say Henry's smarter younger brother. His idea of the strip mall of the future. And he's actually building stuff like this. This is actually one of his projects in Houston. And so what's really interesting also, if you're an aficionado of ethnic food, in most American cities, the good ethnic food is now in the outer suburbs or in the suburban areas. The best Chinese food in North America is in San Gabriel Valley, which is east of Los Angeles, about 5 to 10 miles east. My youngest daughter goes to Hebrew Day School in Northridge, California, which is really on the outer edge of the San Fernando Valley. And it is now where we go for Korean food. There's Korean shopping centers, Korean churches, because, the fact of the matter is most immigrants want to live. One of the reasons they're coming to America is to own a house. That's having space. When my Korean translator on one of my books came over the house, and my house is sort of a falling apart 1930s ranch house, which we hope to be fixing up. And so she went to the house, 2,100 square feet, a nice backyard. She said, only the president of Hyundai lives like this. So I now feel like I'm equal to the president of Hyundai. I mean, you begin to realize how, to other people, what this dream means. And, when I spend time in Korea or China or, of course, Singapore, and I come home, the pleasure I have walking my dog in my neighborhood, which is full of, little single-family homes with nice trees. it just feels like, it feels like you're so privileged on a global level. And the other thing that's going to be important in terms of your businesses and where you may be thinking of developing things is that the immigrants are also becoming a large part of our entrepreneurial class. You can see between 1996 and 2010, the immigrant share of new business startups went from about 15-20% to close to 40. They've been the one group that's continued to start businesses through the recession. Now, the third group is the boomers, or the old population. You can see that population is going to grow very rapidly. So one of the great urban myths is, well, when people get older, they're going to want to move back to the city. Not. I mean, basically, everything I've done the research on, we run a lot of places on a website called newgeography.com. Most older people do not go buy in the city. Now, some wealthy older people buy pied-à-terres in urban areas, but statistically speaking, they're a very small number. Many more go elsewhere, and of course, most of them don't go anywhere. I mean, most people, one of the great mistakes that a lot of urban developers made is they were convinced that once the boomers' kids were finally gone, that they would sell their homes and move into urban places, where maybe it was close to work or maybe they didn't need so much space. It turns out that the vast majority are what we call retiring in place. And they're staying in their homes much longer than anyone. I mean, first of all, people are living a lot longer, and basically they're either moving out to go to assisted living or they're going feet first. And if you go to almost any suburban neighborhood, what you'll see is a lot of older people who have been there for 30, 40, 50 years, and they're hanging on. Their friends are there, their church is there. They like the two activities that grow when you get older are bird watching and gardening. And you probably aren't going to do that in a condo. And also, these people have lived in suburbs for years and years. Sandy Rosenblum was a great expert on this at the University of Arizona. She says, look, somebody who's been living in suburbia for 40, 50 years isn't about to step over homeless people to go to a Burmese restaurant. It's just not, it's just not going to happen. Now, there is going to be a great opportunity in the future to maybe some downscaling, smaller suburban homes in these areas. My mother lives in a place called Rockville Center, New York, and it's really a great area because they have a lot of single-family homes and families, and then they have young people, some of whom commute in the city, and then a lot of older people. I was thinking of the Yiddish word, but I better not use it because somebody might know what I'm saying. So the bottom line is, in this place, there is a, first of all, in terms of the use of the sort of town center of Rockville Center, is that I talked to a businessman there who says, we get the old people for lunch, we get the young people in the evenings, partying on the weekends, and we get the families on like Saturday and Sunday. And this guy's business, he's just doing great. He's got a pub on Park Avenue in Rockville Center. And I think that that's going to be a lot of the future. So the suburbs are not going to stay the same. They're going to become not only more ethnically diverse, but more diverse by age. And there's going to be all sorts of need for new construction. One of the most innovative places I know is Clovis, California, outside of Fresno, where they take the public schools and then in the evenings and the weekends turn them into senior centers. So, why should the public schools be locked up? And, why shouldn't those be community resources? So I think there's some very exciting things to participate in. So anyway, we were asking the question, okay, where did the older people go? 45 to 54 in 2000, 10 years later, where were they? And very different in some senses from that other group. Yes, they moved away from the core cities. That was completely there. If you even look at New York City, the number of people who had been there of that age cohort, where were they 10 years later? But the big difference is they are moving to more exurban areas. They're moving to more rural areas in a way that you don't see with the other population groups. Sometimes for more space, for peace and quiet. The other thing we see, and I have more data, but is a lot of them seem to follow where their kids are. In other words, if the kids go to Raleigh or Charlotte, the parents will go to Raleigh and Charlotte. So there's a lot of that following. And of course, the kids who may have resisted their parents being nearby, but once you have kids, you know what, grandparents are really cheap and good babysitters. Okay. So where are we going overall? And I use the term smart sprawl. I think that you can see this in, if you study the Woodlands, Valencia, Irvine. I mean, you may not like these places yourself, and I don't live there myself. But these are places where there are jobs, there are town centers, there are all different kind of housing. We should be building, I would say, 100, maybe 1,000 new cities in this country in the next 20 or 30 years. And instead of trying to force people to live a way they don't want to live, how do we build how they want to live, but in a more, if you want to use that nauseating term, sustainable way? I think the emphasis on families is important. Village shopping streets. It's very interesting if you go to, let's say, the downtown of the Woodlands. It's actually thriving. It's a very popular place. And you see this in little pockets in sort of LA neighborhoods that are mostly single-family homes, like Sherman Oaks, Studio City, where you have these really nice little walking districts that have popped up really in the last 20 or 30 years. I think the idea of separating some of these with open space is also a very good idea. So the idea is, how do you solve the problem of sprawl within the sprawl? The other thing is, well, it's commonly said, well, how about the question of greenhouse gas emissions? Been a couple of studies, both of them out of Australia, then there's another one came out of Spain. It turns out that actually people in the suburbs don't per capita use much more energy, and actually in some cases less than the people in the urban areas, for reasons having to do with elevators and other public space. Plus, urbanites tend to be big consumers. They go out to restaurants, they buy things that are very expensive and have been shipped from a great distance. So I think you can argue this both ways. I think the point is, you got to deal with the issue of, you cannot tell people how to live in a way that they don't want to live, or that they might want to live if they could afford it. Again, if I could have Bloomberg's house, I'd move to Manhattan, but he hasn't offered it. And the other thing is, the idea is, well, if we get people into the urban core, that's where their jobs are. Well, that isn't where their jobs are. 80% of the commuting in the United States is from suburb to suburb. Only 2 cities in America have anything close to 20% of their employment in their central districts. One is Washington, D.C., which has a very big employer that we can't get rid of, and New York, which was built on a very unique structure. Most others are, the average is about 9.7. Actually, interestingly enough, some of the smaller cities have higher percentages of people working in the urban core because they're easy to get to. You don't have the problem of again, you could work in downtown Nashville and have a 30-minute commute and be in the countryside. So the whole idea that somehow you re-engineer everything so people can go to their jobs in the central core, but the jobs aren't in the central core. The central core is playing a different role in the 21st century than it played in the 20th. And in many ways, more similar to the role it may have played even further back than as a kind of ceremonial center, government center, where certain wealthy populations live, but not, in most cases, most of the job growth is in the suburban areas. And this is particularly true of high technology. If any of you have ever been to Cupertino, it is not exactly an urban area. If you go to Austin, the high tech is all up in what they call the Silicon Hills. It's in the areas on the outskirts of Austin. There are occasional pockets of high tech in urban areas, but the vast majority of it is in the suburban area. And of course, Silicon Valley being a major example. North Dallas is another one. Irvine is another one. So the fact of the matter is you're creating a solution that doesn't meet the reality. So if we take a look at where employment is, this is the Dallas area. And again, you can see how dispersed the employment is. This is the Kansas City area. Probably within this decade, Johnson County, Kansas, which is right across from Kansas City, will surpass Kansas City in employment. It's been growing much more rapidly. Again, dispersion of employment. So a lot of the strategies that are being proposed make no sense because it doesn't solve the problem of where do people go to work. And of course, this is my favorite city, Los Angeles. And you can see the employment centers of Los Angeles are, downtown is about 2.5% of the employment in the greater LA area. Most of the employment is spread out. That's a big country. That's Orange County. That's out what we call the South Bay. Up there is the San Fernando Valley where I live. This is out to the San Gabriel Valley. And what's interesting is when you look at how long it takes to get to work, the commutes are actually shorter in places like Irvine than they are in the center of the city. Now, one of the things that's happened, I have a map in Chicago, which I should have loaded on this one, is that one of the problems is that since jobs are in the suburbs, the people who live in the urban core have an extraordinarily hard time getting to jobs, so they take a long time. So let's say you have the gardeners and the maids who live in what we call Pico Union, which is a very dense area near downtown Los Angeles. And for them to get to work, it takes a long time to get to West LA, which is where all the rich liberals live. And then you can see the commutes they're also very bad in the very far out. But of course, a lot of these areas, there aren't very many people. And by the way, this also comports with another thing, which is the growth of telecommuting. We figure Irvine, it's about 10% of the population telecommutes now. My neighborhood has no rush hour. I have a weird neighborhood that's, a lot of movie people, a lot of gay couples, a lot of Armenians and Orthodox Jews and Persians, you can imagine. But extremely high level of self-employment. Entertainment industry people don't generally go to the studio anymore. They work from home, they go to location. I've studied the entertainment industry for 30 years. And basically, anybody who's succeeded in the entertainment industry has a house, generally in the San Fernando Valley, although Valencia is also a very big center. About 60% of the entertainment industry people live in the valley. And that's the largest entertainment district in the world. So we also said, well, what about gasoline prices? This is one of the typical things that gets regurgitated up in a Pavlovian way. If you look at gasoline prices went up about 45%. The real growth was not in transit, but in working at home. And here's another way of looking at it. Between 2000 and 2010, and of course, driving alone continued to grow, not so much in percentage terms, but overall. So you had almost 8 million more people driving alone to work. You had about 2 million more working at home, and transit was about 400,000. That's after huge investments in rail. Interestingly enough, I have another slide which I can only hit you with so much data. Most of the growth was in buses, because buses actually service the people who need transportation. One of the great outrages as an old-fashioned social democrat, one of the great outrages is spending a fortune on rail systems, which in many cases have very few passengers, and then they take the money away from the bus system. And the whole idea is, well, we'll have the rail system, and the rail system will get a few yuppies to go downtown on the choo-choo train. Meanwhile, we take money away from the bus system that serves the working class. And we've had major lawsuits and fights about this in Los Angeles. I think we have to think about more flexible ways of dealing with transit than the way we've been dealing with it. And the one thing that's perplexing is the decline in the carpooling. That doesn't seem to have worked out very well, and I really don't have the answer for why that is. but it hasn't worked very well. I think it may have to do in part with the fact that employment is now so sporadic and inconsistent, and not that many people work 9 to 5, and not that many people live near somebody who works in the same place. That may be part of it. Now, the big change, I think, down the road is telecommuting part-time or full-time. This is full-time, 34 million now. Forrester thinks 63 million by 2016. I'm a big fan of telecommuting. I've worked at home for 30 years. I like the idea of getting up at 5 in the morning. I can deal with everybody in England early, and then I can make breakfast for my daughters. That kind of strikes me as a good way to live. This whole separation of life as you live it and work, I think, is going to break down. I think your generation is going to break it down. As one of my students once said, why should I spend an hour going from one computer screen to another? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't sometimes come into work or you need to collaborate, and there are certain professions where you have to, but increasingly there are going to be 20 to 30% of the jobs are going to be susceptible to telecommuting. And the big thing about that is, on the architecture side, is the decreasing demand for office space. And by the way, I also think it's one of the reasons why a lot of people are trying to take office space and turn it into residential, because the demand for office space just isn't there nationally. I mean, if you track GDP growth with office space, the less and less of GDP growth goes to the office environment. You know, if you go over the last 20, 30 years, I mean, as a kid growing up in New York in the 60s, I could see the World Trade Center going up. If you walk down the Avenue of the Americas, it was like the way Chinese cities are now, huge amounts of construction. You see sporadic stuff, and a lot of it is residential or cultural. The great thing about telecommuting is it is probably the most efficient and quick way of reducing greenhouse gases or energy consumption, whatever your concern is. And I think that this is one of the things that I have a hard time with new urbanists and with some of the Greens, because they say, you can read, California has draconian land use regulations based on reducing greenhouse gases. And if you read the regulations, the word telecommuting does not exist. And yet in most American cities and most cities in California, more people telecommute than take transit. So why are we not dealing with a very humane way of dealing with the problems? And I also think that this is going to be a great opportunity in the architecture world for retrofitting houses to accommodate people working at home. And what I really like about this is that it means that you can spend more time near your neighborhood and your community. I think that people working at home, like in Studio City, in the area near where I live, many people work at home, and they go to Ventura Boulevard to go out to lunch and hang out, and also you can become more involved in your kids' lives in a very profound and important way. I mean, what's interesting is historically the idea of commuting, of spending a huge part of your day going from A to B, is really a relatively recent phenomenon. Up until the 1890s, most people walked to work or they worked at home. And so I think we're going to see a movement back to that. And that means that you can do much more in terms of local communities. The other thing I think is a really interesting trend, also will affect architects, is the resurgence of multi-generational living. This started before the recession, but in 1940, about a quarter of all families were 3 generations. That dropped to about 12% in 1980. It's now about 16%. So there's been a considerable growth in multi-generational living, and I think now it's probably considerably higher because of the recession. But there is sort of this phenomena of people staying with their families longer or moving back with their families. And one of the nice things about your generation is when we looked at the survey data, they asked them what the source of happiness, 76% said their family. The relationship of millennials to their parents is so different than the boomers to their parents. It's a huge shift. So I see the whole question of family, being close to family, having access to family as becoming more important over time, not less. I always like this quote, no matter how many communes anybody invents, the family always creeps back. At the end of the day, fundamentally, why do you wake up in the morning? You know, what really, at least historically motivates people, and I think should motivate people, is taking care of their families. And whether that's in terms of giving physical care or support, or you know, putting food on the table, I think that's really the intrinsic part of our existence. And I think that as we move away from that, we're headed towards a very scary phenomenon, which is what I'm now studying, which is the fact that so many people are not having children at all. This is particularly severe in Europe and East Asia, but it's starting to happen here too. And I think down the road, a world without children isn't a world worth inhabiting, in my humble opinion, or not so humble. So what matters most? Without appealing to families, countries and cities are in serious, you know, they really stagnate. We have to look at multi-generational as well as multi-ethnic, and as we think about how communities are going to evolve. And I think the regime of, some of it has to do with the regime of planning, but we are creating such high prices in some places that you get extraordinary stratification. You know, New York City is now the, and Manhattan in particular, but New York City is now the most stratified part of the United States, and that was not historically the case. New York was the New York I grew up in had a big middle class and had a big working class, and people stayed there for a long time. That's becoming harder and harder. Either you're at the high end, you're a young person who's sojourning, or you're a young person with rich parents so you can stay longer, or you're a bank robber so you can pay for it, or you leave. And I think that's really unfortunate. So anyway, that's basically what I'm talking about. I would really like to get your questions. I know these are a lot of ideas that have been thrown out that probably are not what you've generally studied, but I hope at least stimulate a little thought.
There must be a few questions. Thank you, Joel, for stimulating and challenging us all. Some of us think Manhattan is the only place, you know.
Well, and I think if you're going to live a certain kind of life, you know.
You can always move back to Williamsburg. Eduardo.
In my case, Flatbush.
I called you. Oh, yes, here we go.
Oh, okay.
It's freezing in here, I apologize. It's down here, it's really cold.
I wanted to see if you could please clarify or expand on your definition of family, which seems to be crucial to your argument, and how have you incorporated into this idea of family gay rights and gender equality?
Gay rights?
Gay rights and gender equality in suburbia?
Well, okay, first of all, in terms of my definition of family, I know I'm a big fan of Stephanie Kuntz, who's done some great writing on this. I think the family, we have this mistaken view that the 1950s is the norm. The 1950s is actually the historical exception. Most of American history in particular, we had what I define in the book as the flexible family. In other words, uncles and aunts, older brothers playing a big role. This was a big thing for immigrants, and also as people went to the West, you know, some people died along the way. If you read the novels of the 19th century, the role of aunts, uncles, cousins was very big. Now, in terms of the gender issue, one in terms of women, you know, one of the reasons I'm a big advocate of home-based business is that it gives usually the woman, it can be the man, somebody stays home a good part of the time. I have refused to send my kids to daycare for most of their lives. I think that they should be raised by their parents, not by somebody else. Yeah, sure, you get help, but you know, I think that's very important for the child and for the child's sense of well-being. And in terms of gays, we have many gay friends in our Hebrew day school. It's Heschel, so it's, you know, you would call it liberal Jewish. We actually we have many gay couples with children going to the Hebrew school. So, you know, I certainly see no problem. I don't understand what it is that makes people so upset. And some of the best parents I know are gay. So I have no problem with it at all. And what's really funny is my kids don't see any problem with it either. They have friends over, and there are two dads and two moms, and they don't care. I think, like racial prejudice against gay people will be close to it, heading towards extinction over time. You take a look, here's a really interesting thing. Think of interracial dating. Among people 65 and older, 45% object. Under 25, 11% object. That's a massive change. Sometimes I tell my older daughter, I said, when I first went to Virginia, my father took me to Virginia, and I saw this, sort of colored-only hotels. I mean, none of you would remember that. Maybe Dean Stern would remember. No, he's too young. But I said to my dad, growing up in New York, I said, what is this colored-only thing? I thought it was like, people painted themselves. And he said, no, black people can't go to the same hotels as white people. My daughter says, no way. And being from the San Fernando Valley, I said, yes way. So these changes, I think that in 20 years, we're going to play back Pat Robertson and those kind of people, and we're just going to think they're as absurd as George Wallace sounds today. Okay.
It's a question way back in the corner on the other side.
He's getting the workout.
He gets the big bucks. He's getting ready to be a waiter.
I thought Yale.
Waiters are graduates of Yale Drama School, by the way.
Oh, okay. All right.
And they're on a very strong career path.
Okay.
Hi. I don't know if your research covers this, but I was curious. You mentioned migration within the country, and then migration within the country, and then migration to United States. But I was curious, migration from the country, meaning people leaving United States, what percentage that is, whether that's significant, and where people are going, and whether that's parallel. Because a lot of you mentioned college graduates and where they're going. And I feel like a good number of my friends went to other countries and then stayed there. So I was curious how those numbers compare to some of the numbers.
Statistically, infinitesimal. I mean, such a small group, so few Americans migrate. Now, in your class, i.e., generally very affluent, very well-educated, highly skilled, there'll be more of that, cosmopolitan. But the numbers of Americans who go abroad is very small. Now, in this recession, there may be some temptations to go to Canada or Australia, but actually those countries are really hard to go for work. Very difficult to get a work permit. The worst grilling I've ever had going into another country, and my wife is Canadian from Montreal, is going into Canada, and God forbid you might make some money while you're there. So I'm always a tourist. I'm visiting family. Australians are freaked out. When I was there recently, about 3 weeks ago, they were so freaked out about 300 boat people. They were acting like it was, sort of the invasion of Spain or something. It was insane. So, but generally speaking, very few Americans long-term leave to go someplace else. There's a very big economy. It's a very big country. You've got lots of alternatives. And most other countries, with the exception of Canada and Australia, a little bit New Zealand, are very closed off. They're not really that welcoming of people abroad. And I know this from my consulting work in Denmark. Let me say that some of the most very virulent racist comments I've ever heard have come from people in Denmark, So I don't think there's much. Anyway, there aren't them. But by the way, in your profession, a lot of, and I've had a couple of students who've gone there. Going to China for 4 or 5 years is probably a great idea. Lots of action, worth doing. You're never going to be Chinese. You're not going to live there. Forget about it.
We need the mic. Edward?
Was that a good New York phrase?
That you're never going to be Chinese, forget about it? Yeah, that's a good thing.
I'll call it on the environmental front and not the sustainability front.
Okay, sure.
So much of the growth is in the South, and I wondered if you see any impacts from global warming coming up, and also water shortages, which we see in the Southwest and in the Southeast, and effects such as that.
Well, the Southwest has had water shortages from day one, always been an arid region. I'm not a climatologist. I just tend to be uncommitted. I'm not convinced of one thing or another. I do think that human beings affect the climate. I think one of the biggest effects not talked about anymore is what we call urban heat islands. Like, for instance, downtown Phoenix in the summer is about 10 degrees warmer than the desert is. So there's, whether density is the solution, I have extreme doubts about. In terms of the sea rise, conceivably a problem. If you work in New Orleans, you're always aware of that particular problem. But in terms of water, let's say in California, which I know very well, there's so much water up in the Sierras, we just don't tap it. And there's a lot of things we don't do in terms of conservation that we could be. For instance, there are crops that we grow in California we probably shouldn't be growing. Given the quality of our climate and our soil, we should really be focusing on very high value-added crops. Growing cotton in California is probably not the smartest idea in history. So there are ways we could be a lot smarter about how we do things. And by the way, also in how we build communities. I'm always astounded when people build communities and they don't plant trees. How difficult is that? So like in my neighborhood, compared to where my mother-in-law lives further out, I would say there's about a 10-degree difference in the summer. And as somebody who rides his bike every day, I purposely go to the streets with the biggest canopy of trees. It's amazing what trees can do. Our house, we have gigantic trees all around our house, and it really makes sense. Now, the interesting thing is also, in terms of Southern California, is building 2 stories is probably not such a great idea. That there was a reason for the ranch house, because generally you can keep cooler with 1 story. And so what I find really hard is, particularly when you go, let's say, to downtown Phoenix and they're building steel and glass towers in downtown Phoenix. Talk about Dante's Inferno. I mean, I can't think of a more unpleasant place to be, except maybe Minneapolis in February, than being out in the desert. Also, my colleague who I do a lot of work with, Ali Medeiros, who's a landscape architect from the University of Arizona originally, he says there are many ways we could cool buildings without using much power. And he has whole case studies of Shiraz and the building of Shiraz and how they were able to build and keep them relatively cool, obviously before air conditioning. One of the great tragedies
He's part of the romance of sustainability movement.
Well, I think he's just really smart. But anyway, but one of the things that he does talk about is that in the Middle East, they're building stuff that's inappropriate to that climate. That you've got to think about what kind of climate you have. There's a reason why in sun-drenched Southern California, you built the Spanish and the Mexicans, and really borrowing from the Romans and the Byzantines and all that way. They built a certain kind of building, which makes sense. And one of the reasons I hold on to my 1937 ranch house is my energy bills are considerably less than those of the more recent houses that have been built. So I happen to be an extremely frugal person personally. So unlike Dick Cheney, I don't think that I don't think there's anything wrong with that as an ethos. I was brought up that way, and whether it's global warming or use of energy or economic, it all fits in together. I think what we need to do, and what would be a great challenge for all of you, is how can you build communities where people can live something like the way they want to live, but in a less energy intense way. And if the architects would focus on that, I think that would be a huge step forward. Trying to force people to live in high density, particularly in the Sun Belt, is really not such a good idea.
Keith, that's a question way back in the... You are giving Edwin a workout tonight.
I think there's some interesting points made, but your tone throws me a little bit because the politics get into it, and I think in a way that, whether from the left or from the right, they actually interfere with a dialogue about these issues.
I didn't think I talked about politics at all.
Well, you didn't, but there were remarks that make clear at least maybe a leaning, or straw men, the Sean Donovan thing.
Well, the Sean Donovan thing is just plain stupid.
But I think to it seems like we need to parse things a little more carefully. So central core city and suburbs, we need to find new ways to talk about conditions of living that don't put us in one of those two poles, the single family house or the apartment building, or the tenement and the single family house, as our, obviously I know tenement's not what you're saying where you're going, but that precludes a certain quality of life. And the one slide I found really fascinating was, I'd really like to know who did it, the shot you showed where there was like a crystal town on a hill surrounded by fields. To begin to, it's kind of absurd, but in fact to think that there might be new models of density that are not high density or sprawl, but new forms of living closer together. A ranch house is not the most ideal house for the climate of Southern California. In fact, if you look at
Compared to
older
what?
Spanish dwellings, they were close together. You have dense, tightly knit streets. You let buildings shade. So my point is, there are moments where I'm like, okay, this, he's asking for design to actually help us here, rather than playing into the old, left, right, city center, suburb
If you
split,
could,
which doesn't get us anywhere.
well, first of all, I mean, but what I was trying to make the point was, here's what the census told us. Here's the conventional wisdom. Maybe we ought to rethink the conventional wisdom. In terms of politics, my politics are very hard to figure out, and even I can't figure them out. I mean, I'm one of the few people who does talk radio and NPR. So, because I think it's the ideas and the facts that matter, to me. Ranch houses are, relative to two-story, the two-story houses they've been building further out, are much less energy intensive. And my neighborhood, for instance, is actually relatively high density, but it is mostly single family houses. Now, one of the reasons you have a relatively high density is a lot of families, and we have a lot of immigrants. And so the immigrants will very likely have, very often the grandparents also live there, and particularly with the Armenian families, the oldest daughter will stay there until she gets married. I mean, you got to remember, I'm living in a community that is somewhere between, 1,500 and 2,100 in terms of, some of it is way out on the fringes, and a lot of it is very, very traditional. And I would say that you could say that about my point of view. Well, I consider myself politically homeless. I think, progressivism sort of has lost its way. It's become very detached from what people actually want, and it is not addressing their fundamental problems. And that's my particular opinion. I don't think the other side has a good answer either. I think that what I found really interesting, I thought the most inspired community building was Valencia, the Victor Gruen, and the developers of the Woodlands, George Mitchell, who was an oil man. And what they did there, and they did a lot of really interesting things with natural features, natural drainage, and it's called the Woodlands because it really is filled with trees. And when you've got a climate like Houston where it's very hot, having a lot of trees is a good idea. So he's done, I think that there are inspirational sites. There are some nice ones in Milton Keynes outside of London is pretty good. And I just think that we're going to need to accommodate this population. And I'm not saying let's go build a bunch more Lancasters and Merino Valleys. I don't think that's the direction you want to go. I think you've got to think about some other ways of building new suburbia and how to refurbish the current suburbia. And I'm not against there being a little more density in some suburban communities. I think what happens is that very often you get a maximalist planning regime that says, oh, I want a 30-story building, where people might take a 2-story, a 3-story building, but they're not going to take a 30-story building. And I've seen that a lot of times.
I think we should call this to a
Okay.
halt
Okay.
and continue it in a more informal manner upstairs in the gallery over some refreshments. Thank you very much.